Well, good evening, everybody, and thank you very much for joining us. Welcome to the webinar presented by the National Animal Welfare Trust, and this is going to be all about nutritional needs from youth to old age in your pets. I should just point out this is going to be more about the nutritional needs through life stage rather than talking about specific ways of feeding, but obviously there is going to be an opportunity to ask questions at the end, so please do feel free to ask questions. So first of all, I'd like to introduce you to the panel this evening, and we're delighted to have two very knowledgeable people from Burns Pet Nutrition here. We've got John Burns, the man himself, who is the founder of Burns Pet Nutrition, and also being joined by Laura Crotch-Harvey, who specialises in feeding cats, and so is going to be talking about the cat side, and John will be talking about the dogs. The third person you see there is me, the mystery voice at the moment. I'm Clare Williams, and I'm the Chief Exec of the National Animal Welfare Trust. So welcome both to John and to Laura. It's great to have you here today. Just before we start, just a little word about the technology. With this webinar, you will be able to see the slides and you will be able to hear the presenters, but you won't actually see us, just the way the technology works. If you've got any problems with the sound, please just type in the chat box that you will see on the panel to the right as you look at it. If you type in there, then we have people that will be able to help you if you're not getting the sound. And also, the different speakers on tonight's session may have different volume controls because we're all in different locations. So that's the beauty of modern technology. If someone's a bit loud, just use your own volume just to turn it down or turn it up. As I said, you can type questions anytime in the chat box, which is on the panel to your right, even while the presenters are speaking. And we're going to take questions at the end once all the presentations are complete. And the webinar is going to be recorded, so if you do have to nip off partway through, then you will receive the recording probably tomorrow through the email, so you'll be able to listen to that. We anticipate we're going to be talking for, with the session will last about an hour. We've got the presentations and then we'll have time for questions. But obviously if there's loads of great questions, then we will carry on for a little bit longer if we can. So first, just a little bit of an explanation about National Animal Welfare Trust, who are your hosts this evening. We're a rescue and rehoming charity. We rescue and rehome mainly dogs and cats, but also rabbits, guinea pigs, horses, ponies, goats, sheep, alpacas, chickens, and various birds, amongst other things. We've got 5 rehoming centres located across the south of England. And we see our role not only as rescue and rehoming, but also we have a wider role to promote responsible pet ownership, and hence the reason why we're able to put on webinars like this. Our funding only comes from donations. We get no government funding whatsoever. So if you have enjoyed this webinar, which is obviously free, but if you do feel you want to make a donation, then please do visit our website, and all donations are very gratefully received. That's the shameless advert out the way. If we just then move on to talk about our relationship with Burns. We were very, very fortunate to be selected as Burns Charity of the Year for this year, 2017. And that's meant that Burns are very generously feeding all our dogs and cats for free, which is fantastic, and I'm sure you can understand as running a rescue to be able to save on your food bills for a year is absolutely fantastic. So we've had a great relationship with Burns. We're really, really grateful for everything they've done. We've done a lot of work together with PR work and events and things, and of course this is the second webinar that we've run. We have run a webinar previously more specifically on different types of food and feeding, and that is available on NAWT's YouTube channel should you wish to go and check that out at a later date. Just one other thing about that's unusual about NAWT is that NAWT is the very first rescue in the UK to introduce the Open Pore Shelter Programme, which is a programme that's been devised in the States. It's probably about 17 years old now, but it's focused very much on reducing stress in the kennels and in the cattery, and also helping the animals present themselves better to new owners, so finding homes quicker, and also teaching them all the great life skills that they'll need to settle in as a new pet once they go to their new home. So it's a little bit like university for dogs or cats. We started off introducing it for dogs because that was a really well developed program, and then in this last year we spent time developing the program for cats as well, and now all our centres are open Pore for dogs and cats. And if you want to find out a bit more about open Pore, and it is a fantastic program and it's making a huge difference to the animals that are in our care, then please go and look on our website and you can find out a bit more about that. And don't you just love that picture of the cat and the dog, or the kitten and the dog? Now, while we're talking about food, I think it's important just to explain why a good diet is really important in rescue. And I have to say, food is one thing we will not compromise on with our animals. We want to make sure they get the best diet that that we can afford, because we know there's all sorts of risks associated with a poor diet, particularly in a stressful situation like being in rescue. And one of the problems that we do risk is our gastroenteritis in our dogs, and sometimes in our cats as well. And that's due to a couple of things, really. One, when they come in, sometimes we're changing their diet from what they were on. We don't, particularly with strays and the like, we don't always get the food that they were on. So sometimes animals can react to that. But also, because their circumstances have changed quite rapidly, overnight pretty much, then sometimes that brings on stress. Living in an environment amongst other animals of the same species can also cause stress, and of course that can cause stomach problems as well. So we can actually help save ourselves money on vet's fees by feeding a really good quality diet. The other issue that we get in rescue is that sometimes the animals come into us in a fairly poor condition. Sometimes they've got skin ailments, sometimes they've got poor coats, sometimes they're underweight, and quite often they're actually overweight. So the type of diet that we use and the way we use that diet can actually help with those conditions. And you'll see there the photo, two photos of the gorgeous Stanley, who is a dog that came into us. You can see in the top there how horrendously thin he was. He was found just tied to a tree. Terrible, terrible condition. You can see that picture of him there, which was a few months later, thanks to good food and a bit of TLC, and he was rehomed by one of our kennel staff, and if you see him now, you wouldn't recognize him. He's a happy, very healthy dog, and that's all down to really good diet. So what we feed is incredibly important in a rescue environment, but the other thing that's really important to us is how we feed that food, and that all comes back down to open Pore and what we're doing there, because food is the highlight of the day for a lot of, particularly for the dogs and pretty much for the cats as well. And the risk is if you just feed it in a bowl, it's gone in a nanosecond, and you've lost a huge amount of opportunity for enrichment and mental stimulation. So with open Pore, both for the dogs and for the cats, we throw away the food bowls. We very rarely feed in a food bowl now unless the animal specifically needs it. And we use the food in different ways. So one of the things that we do with open Pore is that we have a process whereby anybody who walks past the kennel or the cat pen, they just drop some food in. And the whole idea being that animals then learn, dogs and cats learn, that humans approaching is a really good thing. And you don't need to jump, and you don't need to spin, and you don't need to bark, or if you're a cat, you don't need to hide away or disappear outside, because good stuff happens, the food arrives. And so we take a daily amount, part of the daily amount of the kibble, and we put it in these little holders that you can see in the top two photos there on the pens. And we have little feeding tubes so that anybody who walks by just drops some food in. And what you end up with is dogs and cats sitting at the front of the pen waiting to be fed, which is fantastic because it means they're interacting with people and will hopefully find their new home quicker. Then when we feed meals, we feed them in different ways, and you'll see the two bottom photos on the left. There we use kongs, we use mazes, we use green feeders, we use whatever we can, just so that the meal lasts longer, it's stimulating the animal mentally. They have to work to get their food out, and what that means is that you get a much more relaxed animal, dog in this case, in the kennel. To the other side on the right, you can see some of the things we use for the cats. We use the bottom photo there is a little it's quite a soft plastic feeder, because we find the cats don't like the really hard ones, because they don't like the feel of their whiskers on it. So that's a nice soft maize feeder, and we can put some wet food in there if we need. And then the middle photo there with the black cat, you can see something that's called a no-bowl feeder. And that was developed by a vet in the States, and is something that we use with all our cats now, because you can actually hide the dry food within the plastic bit in the middle. There's a little mouse skin there. You can, well, it's not real mouse skin, obviously, a fabric mouse that goes over the top, and then you can hide that around the pen. So the cat has to hunt for their food. They find their food. They have to play around with it till they get the food out. So we're feeding into all those lovely natural instincts with the cat, and giving them some exercise just by feeding them. So fantastic product as well. So all our animals are fed in all sorts of different ways, and that just adds to the enrichment of their day. So that's enough from me as an introduction. I just love this photo as well. It's always a good excuse to use lots of lovely photos when we do a webinar. And I hope you enjoy the webinar, and we're just going to change over the screens now, so that I hand you over to John Burns, who is going to start the full session on the webinar. Enjoy.
Right, thank you very much, Claire, for that, and my thanks to the NAWT for organising this webinar. So just, if I can just make a start on this here. You okay with it? Can you see that all right on screen now?
Yep, that's good, John.
Good. Okay, right. Well, this is me, John Burns. I'm a veterinary surgeon, of course, but I'm also an acupuncturist, and it was my interest in study of traditional medicine which stimulated my interest in nutrition. And I feel I've now got the best of both worlds, the scientific training in veterinary science and also what comes from traditional medicine. I think this gives me a special insight into nutrition. So this is the seminar, Feeding Your Pet Friend, Nutritional Advice from Youth to Old Age. I want to make some general comments about feeding which are applicable to all ages. This is Burns Pet Nutrition. We're based in Kidwelly in West Wales. People often ask me how many people work for the company. My answer to that is, oh, usually about half of them. But of course, that's not really true. We've got such a wonderful team here, so of whom I'm very proud. So, LateStage Nutrition is the practice of feeding foods designed to meet the animal's nutritional needs at a specific age or physiological state. Originally, pet food was formulated to meet all ages and stages. So, in other words, the puppy food was intended to feed, for example, canned food and mixer was intended to, a complete canned food would be intended to be fed as a complete food to all dogs, puppies, right through to old age, and it could be fed either on its own or even with mixer. So a bit of a blunderbuss effect there. Now we're a bit more precise about that now. Not precise isn't the right word actually, but we're trying to be a bit more tailored to the needs of the animal. But I should say that nutrition isn't an exact science, although some pet food manufacturers might try to claim that it is. I've seen the term precise nutrition, but for me that's a myth. Precise means exact or pinpoint accurate. And every individual, when far as dogs are concerned, there are 8 million of them, they're different. And one food can't meet the needs of all of those 8 million. And as for the food itself, well, with the best will in the world, there will be some, because we're using food as ingredients here, then there will be some very slight variations continuously. Fortunately, there are broad parameters within which one can meet the needs of the individual without exceeding them. and the body itself is designed to make its own adjustments within certain limits. I'd like to add to that, say something about breed-specific diets. In my opinion, this is simply a marketing tool. Different breeds, in my view, do not have requirements specific to their breed. In fact, there's more variation need within a breed, for example, young, working, elderly, and so on, than there is between breeds themselves. An important point I want to make here, and I'll come back to that, is that in our society, exceeding the needs of pets is much more prevalent than being deficient. We're all familiar with the concept of having a strong constitution. What that means is that you're basically healthy. And in traditional medicine, the constitution is viewed as your health when you're born, which is determined primarily by the health and the diet of the pregnant mother. So just a little recommendation, potential pet owners are often advised to see the mother and perhaps the father when they're buying a puppy. It'd be also worth checking out the diet of the parents, especially the mother. You might see a cuddly puppy, but should you buy it if it's being fed on a very poor quality food? Of course, I believe that you can still have a positive or even a negative impact on health through the daily life, especially the diet. So how to choose a food? Well, I'm not going to go through this. You'll be able to follow up on this later if you wish. But there are a lot of different foods available. And there are different methods of feeding. So we have, I mentioned canned food and mixer, which is probably less popular now. There's been a trend towards dry complete foods, which are more convenient and more economical, and they're more accurately geared towards the needs of the individuals. One can also have a moist food, and it's possible to combine the moist and the kibble, and this could be, the kibble could be the form of mixing moist and complete food, or mixing moist and mixer. Actually, the form of the food, whether it's wet or dry, is less important than the ingredients, in my view. There's a trend towards raw meat now. Dogs can't actually digest raw vegetables. I wouldn't want to say much about raw feeding because when I do, I find that my staff are subjected to a lot of abuse when I make comments on raw food, so I'm going to leave that one. Grain-free is becoming much more popular now and it's gaining ground, but the justification for it is flawed in my view. It's because it's founded on two scientifically inaccurate claims. First is that the first claim, which is wrong, is that dogs can't digest cooked grains, which is not the case at all. And the second inaccuracy is that dogs are said to be allergic, or grains cause allergies or intolerant reactions, but that's not at all true, except possibly for wheat. Grain-free tends to be more expensive, and my personal opinion is that the benefits from the alternative ingredients are not as good as the benefits one gets from whole grains. Having said that, Burns are about to launch a grain-free range because that's what the market dictates. We'll be using buckwheat, which sounds as if it's a grain, but it isn't, and we expect that to deliver similar health benefits to whole grains. One thing I actually failed to put in this list is what I might call supermarket type foods. One looks at the ingredient list and ingredients are listed generically, which is a polite way of keeping the consumer in the dark. For example, the ingredient listing may be meat and meat derivatives, cereals and cereal derivatives, EC permitted preservatives, and so on. By doing this, the manufacturer can change the ingredients without changing the label. But the second advantage for the manufacturer is that it also keeps the consumer from knowing what they're actually getting. And it's not, I would never recommend a food where ingredients are listed in that way. The most important thing, of course, is the effect on the pet's health. And as I said already, there's 8 million dogs and they're not all the same. And one particular method of feeding can't suit every dog. Some will have idiosyncrasies which will affect what they can eat. You may know that I'm a great advocate of the merits of whole grains, controlled levels of protein and fat, and high complex carbohydrate, and this is something that's worked for me for 40 years. So, feeding amounts. I think we could do an entire seminar on this one. It's actually, the feeding amount is almost as important as the type of food, and it's also the most misunderstood. Overfeeding or overnutrition undoes the value of good food. Most pet owners would like to be given an exact number of grams of food to feed, but life isn't like that. We like to think of our pets as individuals, so when it comes to feeding, why would we expect them all to be fed the same as other dogs? Just to show you this, you may have seen this before, this is a graph showing number of dogs against the percentage of energy needs. In the middle, as you might expect, which would be the average energy need, the maximum number of dogs are there or thereabouts. Looking at the middle, most dogs are close to average, and the majority will be around the middle. But on the extreme left-hand side, you've got a small percentage of dogs who only need 50% of the average. And on the extreme right-hand side, some dogs need 150% of the average. So comparing both sides there, some dogs can need 3 times as much of other dogs of the same size and weight. So there's a massive potential variation in energy need. I want to put up 2 myths for you here. The first one probably isn't really a myth, it's a misunderstanding. It says I'm feeding what it says on the bag. Well, I've just covered that when I was talking about variations in need. Many pet owners saying, oh, I can't be overfeeding because I'm feeding what it says in the bag. Or another one is, I can't be overfeeding as my dog isn't overweight. I'm going to come back to that in a second. Overfeeding is actually the scourge of the world of pets. This applies to dogs, cats, and rabbits, and other pets too. And it applies to all ages, from puppies to the elderly. So, reasons to increase the amount of food, just from the average or the starting point. Living in a kennel, heavy physical activity, later stages of pregnancy or nursing, underweight. But sometimes it's better to consider using a higher energy dense food rather than just feeding more of a particular food if a dog has a higher energy need. Here are reasons to reduce the amount of food. Neutered, senior, less active, an ongoing health problem. And if you see my health guide, there's a lot of information about that there. Overweight, warm weather or a warm house, a fussy dog, or a dog which is prone to bark and be noisy and yap a lot. Very often that can be caused by overnutrition. We've produced a range of leaflets on various health issues, and I just mentioned my veterinary guide there, which is the bottom right-hand side. In that, I've listed a number of health problems where overnutrition is a factor. Just to give you some examples, itchy skin, waxy ears, runny eyes, full anal glands, persistent molting, hyperactivity, which I just mentioned, upset digestion, dry, scaly skin, tooth tartar, and so on. So in other words, there are a lot of health issues other than excessive weight which can be caused by overnutrition. So, with those important factors in mind, let's say something about the life stages, starting with puppies. We have produced a puppy guide which you can get from Burns or Stockis or download it. Important thing when you get a new puppy is it should settle in the same food for at least a week and then change over gradually to your preferred choice. Using Burns as an example, the starting point for a puppy would be around 20 grams per kilo, and for a junior 15 grams per kilo. But remember again, that's just a guide. Here's some puppy feeding tips from Laura. Weaning off the mother's milk starts at 3 weeks, and 3 meals a day, or even 4 perhaps, should be gradually reduced until you get to about 6 months. Thereafter, a puppy is starting to become an adult, depending on the size of the dog. So, Claire just mentioned the feeding toys. Growth. Now, rearing, for some people, some pet owners, rearing a puppy seems to be a contest to see how macho they can be, how much size and weight they can get onto their dogs. And this is a major problem, especially for the larger breeds. Rapid weight gain is dangerous, especially for these large breeds, and it can cause musculoskeletal problems and obesity and lifelong health problems, in fact. The aim is to have the puppy to grow slowly and steadily, if possible. Excessive weight. Overweight puppies become overweight adults. And I mentioned the orthopedic disease from too rapid weight gain. Many pet owners worry that their dogs are not getting enough to eat, but in fact, there are far more problems caused by excess energy intake rather than a deficiency. So adult dogs. So when do we go to an adult food? Well, again, this depends a lot on the size of the dog. Small breeds can change over around 5 months or 6 months. Larger breeds take a lot longer. And I think discretion is needed a little bit too. You know, if the dog's doing well, then you might be, especially with a larger breed, to just delay when you change from the food for growth onto the adult food. We mentioned the problems of obesity. In the veterinary profession, this is a PDSA well-being report. The veterinary profession's views on pet obesity. I'm puzzled by the second of the one on the right there. It says 35% of vet professionals have identified obesity as one of the biggest health and welfare implications in 10 years' time, if not tackled. 35% in 10 years' time. I find that's incredible, really, because we've already got this problem where obesity is probably the most common health problem affecting pets now, except for tooth tartar and gum disease. So the important thing is that for weight reduction, we require a specifically designed food. There's a lack of understanding what's a healthy body weight. Many people think that their pets, when they're overweight, they think that's normal. And people with a lean dog are often, might just run the risk of being stopped in the street and told that their dog is too thin. So, as I say, you need to have a food specifically designed for weight reduction. And the feeding amount should be adjusted, and feeding should be according to the target weight rather than the present weight. There's a condition chart. The ideal, there's a rarity in my experience, to see a lean dog now is almost worth commenting on. Fussy eaters. I mention this because it's remarkable how many people don't seem to realise that the pet is fussy because they're not hungry. Fussy eaters aren't born, they're made, and they're made by pet owners overfeeding their pets. Seniors. Well, when does a dog become a senior? Well, it depends on the breed. Probably a giant breed would be about 6-7 years of age, whereas a small dog, 12 years would probably be about a senior. Aging results in the decreased ability to meet the demands of the environment. Many pet food manufacturers have life stage foods, senior ones for young or mature adults, and then a different food for seniors. But my adult foods, or the senior foods in that case, would be with lower fat and protein in them to meet the reduced needs of the older dog. But my adult foods already have that reduced or controlled levels of fat and protein, so I don't feel that there's any need to reduce them. So in my case, in the case of most of the Burns foods, the food for the young adult will also suit the senior also. Sometimes an older dog will, when it becomes very old, lose interest in food, and they have to be encouraged. And I know with my own dog, Lizzie, when she got to 12-year-old, I changed her off dry food completely and put her onto the moist Penland food, and suddenly gave her a new interest in life. I don't know quite whether that was because the food was more tasty or whether it made a difference. So, to sum up there, good health and well-being, there's two strands to this. One is getting the right type of food, and almost as important, if not equally important, is getting the correct feeding amount. So that's all I've got to say on the subject. I'm going to pass you over to Laura now.
Thank you very much, John. So we're just going to swap over slides to Laura and let her talk to you about cats. So over to you, Laura.
Hi everyone. So my name's Laura Crotch-Harvey, and sorry, can you see the side panel on your screen?
We can see the slides, Laura. Yeah, that's fine.
Okay. So yeah, I'm one of the nutritional advisors for Burns Pet Nutrition, and I work on the helpline. So we help people to decide which food to feed their pets and how much to feed. I've also got a master's degree in animal science. So I'm going to be talking about cats today. So I'm not going to talk about which food to choose too much. John's sort of talked about that a little bit. Obviously, the quality of the food is important. You want to look for high quality ingredients. Simple recipes are great because there's less chance that it's going to cause any problems then, less things for the cat to react to. And a complete food is also really good because you know it's got all the nutrients in there that your cat's going to need. It's been specially designed to meet that cat's needs. So age it's worth taking into account all of these different points really when looking to pick a diet for your cat. So age is really important. A kitten is going to need a different food from a senior cat. Kittens need more calories, more protein and fat because they're growing. And the senior cats don't need as much protein and fat. The breed of the cat is important. I agree with John as in like you don't need specific foods for that breed of cat, but certain breeds may not be as active as other breeds on a whole anyway. Some cats have quite a small mouth, so the kibble size is quite important for them, so it's worth taking it into account. If they've been neutered is important because they'll need lower calorie foods in general. Indoors or outdoors is important, so if your cat's living inside, they're obviously not as active, they've got the heating on, they're nice and warm, and an outdoor cat will be running around doing a lot more exercise, so they may need a different diet to each other. Body condition is important. If you've got an overweight cat, they're going to need a different food to an underweight cat. And also any other concerns, so if the cat does have health problems, they may need a special diet to take that into account. So kittens from 8 weeks up to 9 months. So with kittens, they tend to need more calories for their adult size, for their size than an adult would, and that's because they're growing. Free feeding is the easiest way to feed the food. But it's more accurate if you weigh out the food every morning. Free feeding is when you just put the food down and the cat just helps himself really, so they eat as much as they want, but it can lead to obesity, so it is best if you can weigh it out and split it into at least 2 meals really. You want to monitor their weight and body condition as they grow. You can use a body condition chart to do this. I'm going to be talking about that in a minute. And also you'll need to adjust their feeding amounts as they grow as well. Most cats will be full grown at about 10 months old, but they do continue to gain muscle then, often until about 12 months old, so they may still gain a bit of weight. They don't necessarily need to have any treats, and really it's best if they don't, but if they do, then they should be less than 10% of their daily amount of food. And for kittens, cow's milk isn't really advised because it can lead to diarrhea. They don't digest the lactose very well. So I've got 5 kitten feeding tips. So it's always best to let them settle in first when you get them home. They've got a lot to take on board, so the last thing we want to do is start changing their diet as well. Then when you are ready to wean them over, just do it gradually over around 2 weeks, just mixing the 2 foods together. Any changes you make, it's always best to do it gradually. So if you need to change their feeding amounts, if you need to cut their food back or increase it, just do that gradually too so they get used to it. You can try different types of bowls or feeding toys to see what they prefer. Some cats are quite fussy and they don't like their whiskers touching the sides of the bowls and things like that. You can soften the dry food with some warm water if they prefer this, and that helps to release a bit of the smell from the food and also helps to increase their water intake. And again, if they do have any treats, they'll need a bit less food. So adult cats, so that's from about 9 months old. So normally we move on to adult food at 9 months, then they're considered a young adult until 6 or 7 years old, then they're just sort of a standard adult, and then normally between 11 to 14 years old they become a senior. It really does vary from cat to cat, which is why I've got the normally in bold there. So the goal is to maintain maximum health, longevity and quality of life. Individual cats can vary a lot, and some can need 50% under or over the recommended amount on the bag, as John touched on earlier. No single feeding method is suitable for all cats. There's a lot of factors involved really, such as if there's other pets in the house, because they might be stealing each other's food, the owner's time schedule, and if they work full time and things like that can have an effect. Feeding toys are really good to use for enrichment, and there's various different ones you can get for cats and dogs. And then also meeting their minimum protein need is critical for a cat. They need 2 to 3 times more protein than a lot of other animals, and they do have a specific requirement for protein, so that's why feeding a complete food is really good for cats. So neutering, the metabolic rate of cats reduces by about 30% once they've been neutered, but their appetite actually increases by 25%. So this means although they need less food, they actually want to eat more food, so they are a lot more prone to gaining weight. You may need to change their diet after they've been neutered. Burns cat food is already quite low in fat, so it is suitable for neutered cats, but you may need to reduce their feeding amounts down further. We've got a separate guide for a feeding guide for neutered cats. Okay, now I'm going to talk about obesity, which is one of the major problems with sort of the young adult cats. If they've been neutered, obviously we've just talked about that, they are more likely to gain weight. Indoor cats, they're living inside, they're not doing as much exercise, so they can be more at risk. But also outdoor cats, even though they are out doing more exercise, they might be eating food at the neighbour's house, or they might be hunting and eating all sorts of things. So even outdoor cats can be prone to gaining weight. 28% of cats aged 7 to 12 years old are thought to be obese, so it is a big problem in cats. So what we'd say is to put a measured amount down, and they can eat it throughout the day then, so you know they're not going to overeat. If they're quite greedy and they eat it all in one go, then try and split it into 2 or 3 meals. Feeding set meals should help to reduce their hunger throughout the day, because if they eat it all in the morning, they've got nothing else to eat then the rest of the day. And that can also help to minimise hunger-related behavioural problems. And also using feeding toys can be really good for that as well. A significant proportion of obese middle-aged cats die before they reach old age, so that shows it does have a big effect on their health. So it is really important that we don't let them get obese really, and help them sort of lose the weight if they are. And it's also worth noting that predatory drive is so strong in cats that they will sometimes stop eating to hunt. And some owners confuse this with predatory. They confuse this behaviour with hunger, so they just think the cat's hungry all the time and they're looking for food, when actually it's just more of their natural instinct to be hunting for food. So this is our body condition chart to help you see if your cat is overweight or if they're the ideal weight. So you should be able to easily feel the ribs. They should have a nice waist, which you can see from the side and above. If they're underweight, in a short-coated cat, you'll be able to see the ribs, and they have quite a tucked-in waist, be quite bony. And then for the overweight cats, they've lost that waist and you can't easily feel the ribs. They sometimes get some sagging skin under the abdomen. And then we'll go on to senior cats. So there's 3 common problems in aging cats. They may have reduced movement and arthritis. So we're going to talk a little bit more about this on the next slide. And older cats tend to have a problem with weight loss. So rather than obesity, once they get to this stage, being skinny is more of a problem. And renal disease is also the leading cause of death amongst cats. I'm not really going to go into that one today because it is more of a veterinary issue, so if you are concerned about that, then speak to your vet, but it is worth mentioning that it's a major problem in cats and they do need a special diet if they've got that sort of problem. So with joint problems, about 90% of cats over 12 years old have arthritis. This has only really been recognised in the past 10 years or so. It didn't used to be seen as such a big problem in cats, and that's because the symptoms are quite different than in other animals, especially dogs. So in cats, symptoms can be aggression, they may not be grooming themselves as they normally do, or sometimes they over-groom themselves, they can be licking at a painful joint, so people don't always recognise it as a problem. Omega-3 fatty acids have been shown to be really useful, and they can have an anti-inflammatory effect, so I think that's why they have such a good effect. So that's definitely worth looking at adding into the diet if the cat does have this sort of problem. Glucosamine and chondroitin are not so useful in cats, and also obesity is a major risk factor, so it's really important that the cat loses weight because the joints aren't going to have as much pressure on them then if the cat can lose the weight. So skinny older cats. So after 12 years old, obesity is really rare in cats. Is there a cause? So if the cat is losing weight, we need to look what is the cause. It's best to get them checked out by a vet to see if they can find anything, because they might have a special dietary recommendation based on this. It can be due to health problems, dental disease, or stress, so it's quite important they do get checked over. But 30 to 40% of cats over 12 may have fat malabsorption. So this means they're not absorbing the fat from their diet as well as they used to when they were younger. So some of the fat from their diet will just pass straight through and won't be digested. And they can also have problems with digesting protein. So 20% of cats may have a decreased ability to digest protein. Studies have shown that things such as vitamin E, omega-3 and prebiotics can be beneficial, so that's definitely worth looking into. So just in conclusion, the needs of cats and dogs vary throughout their lifetime. Obesity is a major problem in pets in the UK and can lead to a number of health problems. So everything always links back to obesity, it seems, so it's definitely worth paying a lot of attention to that. And using a high quality food and monitor your pets throughout their lifetime, especially check their weight and their feeding amounts and adjust accordingly. So it's not a one-size-fits-all approach, and you definitely need to keep an eye on your pet throughout their whole life, really. So thank you for listening. I'll pass you back.
Thank you very much, Laura and John. I found that fascinating. I'm always fascinated by feeding and food, and not just myself, but with the dogs and cats as well. So that was a really, really interesting insight, and I hope you all found that fascinating as well. So we've got some time for questions, and if you do have any questions, please do feel free to type them into the chat box, and we will pick those up. I've got one here to start with. I'm not sure who wants to answer this. John, if I can just ask you to, that's it, thank you. So here's the first question. I've got an 18-month-old spayed pug who's become a little overweight. I'd like to change her diet for something that will help her lose weight with exercise. I'm currently feeding kibble only and have started to cut down the feed into 3 smaller portions a day. Is that the right approach? Shall I send that one to you first, John?
Okay, thank you very much. Well, 3 meals a day, I'm not so sure about that for an overweight dog. She mentions feeding kibble. That's really not enough information. And in my presentation, I said that when you're trying to get the weight off a dog, then one has to use a food specifically for that purpose, rather than just relying on a normal food and trying to control the feeding amount. So, food for weight loss or weight control, and a measured amount per day based on the target weight, and even then a little bit underneath that feeding amount, and that can be measured out and it's fed. The daily feeding amount, once that's been decided upon, can be fed 2 or usually twice a day, I would have said, would be plenty. The number of meals per day is less important than the amount itself. The exercise, yes, of course, it goes without saying that that's going to help a bit, but the best, most important consideration here is controlling the amount of food. For treats, it might be a good idea to think of low-fat or non-fat treats, such as raw vegetables would be very good. But any treats should be minimal, and they should be low-fat, and they should be taken into account when calculating the daily feeding amount. So, feeding amount, just to sum up, a food specially for weight control, a feeding amount which would be a little bit underneath the amount for the target weight, and no treats or low-fat treats, especially raw vegetables. That would be my advice.
Thank you. That's hopefully that's very helpful advice, and I think it's always important to look at the overall diet, isn't it, when you've got an overweight pet, because sometimes it's not the meals itself, it's a bit like us humans, isn't it? It's what's going on in between the meals, what's fed in between the meals, that can often be the problem. And I'm guessing the other thing which you've experienced as a vet is, if the dog is overweight, not to go crazy with the exercise to start with, and to build the exercise up as well.
Well, I think that makes good sense. I didn't mention that, but yes, one has to start gradually and work up to it a little bit. Yeah. Okay,
thank you. So we've got another question here about cats, and this is from Mark. It says, it's all about feeding carbohydrates to cats. How much should a cat need? And also, if a cat eats kibble, oops, I've just lost my question there, is eating kibble and then just eats the jelly off the wet food, should they be encouraged to eat one or the other? So kind of 2-part question there. So one is, how much carbohydrate do cats need, and then the other one is about where you've got a cat that's eating kibble and just the jelly from the wet food. So do you want to pick that one up, Laura?
Yeah. So with the one where they're eating the jelly from the wet food, then that's not going to be ideal, because they're sort of altering the balance of the nutrients they get in there. So if the cat would happily just eat kibble, then I'd cut the wet food out, because he's probably not eating as much of the kibble and then eating some of that jelly instead, so he might not be getting everything he needs there. With the carbohydrate, cats, the protein is more important for cats, so you have to make sure they're getting all the protein that they need. But once you've reached that and they're getting everything they need, the rest is then excess waste, and can put extra strain on the kidneys and things like that, whereas whole grains and carbohydrates can give a steady release of energy. So if they're having carbohydrates, it sort of balances out the protein to make sure they're not getting too much protein and fat, because the food will be made up of protein, fat, carbohydrate and fibre, so it's just getting that balance right for them really. If it was just no carbohydrates and all meat, it would be quite a lot for the sort of kidneys and everything to cope with, and as mentioned that kidney problems are a big problem with cats.
Yeah, that's interesting because Mark's just added a little bit now and says the cat concerned is now overweight but is on a measured weight loss diet. So
right, so yeah, it's a case of just getting all those nutrients balanced in. That's why a complete diet is so good really, because it's already done for you, but you've just got to make sure it's the right complete diet for that cat. So if it's a high fat one, then maybe they need a lower fat one.
Yeah, would I be right in thinking our cat food has about 40% carbohydrates in it, but it's whole grains, so that can be. It's not just the type. It's not just quantity of carbohydrate that counts. It's the type of it, type of carbohydrate. Carbohydrate comes in many forms, from glucose, which is the simple sugar, through the complex carbohydrates and grains, to indigestible cellulose, actually. So. But in general, cats can handle and do well on a carbohydrate diet, but I think ours is around the 40% mark. Is that right, Laura?
Yeah, I think it's somewhere around there.
Good. Well, Mark says thank you. So obviously you've helped solve his problem there. So we've got a question here from Celia, who has 2 miniature poodles, oh lovely, and they're aged 5 and 9. And she says she's feeding them both the same dry food, but should the older dog need to move on to a senior food? That's a good question.
Do you want to answer that,
well,
John?
Yes, thank you. Well, a miniature poodle at 9 years isn't really a senior dog, not yet, or shouldn't be. So you should be able to feed them on the same food for quite a while yet. As I said in my own presentation, our standard adult foods are generally suitable for older dogs anyway. So, yeah, just as for example, chicken and brown rice can be fed from young adult right through to geriatric. So, but certainly a 9-year-old miniature poodle isn't a senior yet.
And
anything? Would you like to add anything to that, Laura?
Yeah, even if it was a senior, then they could potentially be on the same food in a few years' time. So, but they might not. The senior dog might need a bit less food. So, but yeah, miniature poodles live till quite old, don't they?
So, is there a sort of time or is there a sign that tells you need to move on to a senior food, or is it just I don't know, how would you know when it's time to move a dog onto a senior food, if indeed you need to at all? I know I certainly, with my senior dogs, they ate the same as the younger dogs and seemed fine. So
yeah, we tend to say it's like with humans. When we get older, we don't eat a different type of food, but we might eat a bit less food. So a lot of times with senior dogs, as they start to slow down, we just cut their food back a bit. There's certain foods we don't recommend, and we don't want the mineral content and things like that to be too high. But in general, they just tend to need a bit less than they did when they were younger and more active.
Anything else, John?
No, I think that's fine. As I say, we're a bit at Burns, we're a wee bit different from other companies in that My Foods is calibrated to be suitable for young adults as well as senior adults anyway.
So here's a question then. The question is, are cats really fussy eaters? Because it's always that thing that you always think cats are fussy eaters, and you need to give them a different flavour of food every meal. Is that true, or is that a myth?
I find they are quite fussy eaters. With a dog, you can we just say, well, put the food down, and if they've got no health problems, they won't starve themselves. They will just eat it when they realise nothing else is coming, but sometimes they'll try for something else. A cat will try a lot longer for something else, and they can be a lot more picky than a dog. I think they've got their own mind a bit more, haven't they, than a dog? So we do find they are a bit more fussy. Probably to some extent, I doubt they would starve themselves, but they're definitely more fussy than dogs are.
They're just cats. They just know how to work humans better.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yes, I'm just going to say I don't think that cats are inherently fussy. They're not born that way. They're made that way. Same as not quite the same as dogs, perhaps. Problem with cats is, of course, if you put the food down and they don't eat it, they might go and get food somewhere else, and so you could a cat owner could be competing with the neighbours up the road. But cats are quite small. Their feeding amounts are not as high as most people think, so it's so easy to overfeed them. And then the cat becomes fussy. They don't like the food, according to the owner, when in fact the cat is really just saying, "I'm not hungry." But the cat owner then says, "Oh, he doesn't like that anymore. We'll get something else, usually something tastier with more fat and protein." And then when the cat's, had too much of that and becomes fussy, they have to look for something different and tastier yet again. So there's a kind of vicious cycle here, which can be quite difficult to break. But I think best not to get into that situation in the first place.
Yeah.
That's fascinating. And a dog-related question here. This is someone whose Labrador had Giardia as a puppy, and they've been really struggling to find a food that the lab can eat and hold down and sort of give some good poos and everything like that. And the question is really if you are changing a food and trying to find the right food for your dog, how long should you sort of give it to see if the food works or not before you change the food and try a different one?
Well, the answer is it depends. If you have a dog with a sort of upset digestive system, and then you change the food onto a new food, because if the gut is damaged when you start, then sometimes the protein can be absorbed into the body, and then the dog will then become allergic to it. So sometimes it's worth considering starting off with what's called a sacrificial protein, and that means to say you give something unusual and something that you don't intend to use on a long-term basis. One example of that might be egg, or it might be ostrich or something like that. Something you're not going to be using all the time. And then you introduce that food, very small amount, very small, and hopefully given a little bit of time, let's say at least a couple of weeks, when the intestine can settle down and the dog can become adapted to that. But it's very, very important to keep the feeding amount very low. And once the intestinal problem settles down, you can then gradually, over a week or two, switch on to the food that you want to use longer term. It sounds as if I'm making it complicated, but it's a way of avoiding the dog developing a sort of allergy reaction to one food after another.
Yeah.
It's a very difficult one, isn't it?
Yep.
Sorry, go on.
Yeah. Yes, but getting the right food for a dog with a problem like that, you have to be thinking of, number one, highly digestible and hypoallergenic. That means one protein source only, and and then thirdly, very small feeding amounts. So even if the dog was underweight because of this chronic digestive problems, and there's always a temptation to increase the feeding amount and get some weight on. That's really got to be resisted. First, the priority is sorting out the upset digestive system, and then the weight gain would then take care of itself over a number of weeks then.
Yeah, that's it sounds like you've just got to do it in stages and do it steadily, and there's no real quick fix to that, is there?
Another point I want to make is that so many people just do this all on their own, and with a serious health problem, then it's like it's like a human trying to treat a health problem without getting professional advice. it really needs to be done with the advice. That's why we have a nutrition team, which is headed up by Laura, to give that specialist advice to pet owners with that sort of problem. A lot of people don't see the results or the benefits because they do it on their own without that specialist advice.
Yeah, that's all good advice. I hope that answers that question. So Celia with the miniature poodle says thank you very much. That was a very helpful answer to that the question previously. And we've got a question from Rob, who says that his cat is now 15 and the vet has suggested that she goes on to a senior diet. What would you recommend?
Well, obviously with Burns food, with our cat foods anyway, we don't have adults and senior foods, so it's just the one food that's suitable for both adults and seniors, and we just their feeding amounts then as they get older. It also depends on the cat and if they're having any of the problems we talked about before, if they were overweight, underweight, that sort of thing. But yeah, you just want a high quality food with good ingredients really, and then just sort of look to target any problems you're having.
I guess it's also something the cat's happy to eat as well.
Yeah.
Sorry, can I just chip in here?
Yeah.
We only have a dry complete food, which is a chicken variety or a fish, but we're going to change. We're going to have a moist or a range of moist cat foods as well. So some cats which are very very old cats, again, they might lose their appetite or lose interest. So sometimes a moist food can be useful to counteract that, or even soaking with warm water a dry food.
Yeah. Particularly if the teeth are starting to go, I guess. So yeah, you like this question, John, I'm sure. This one's from Jill, and it is it true that you get what you pay for in pet food? Nice and succinct.
Well, yeah. In general, yes. In general, that can be true because good quality ingredients tend to be more expensive than poor quality ingredients. I mentioned earlier about, in connection with grain-free, that there's no, in my view at least, there's no special merit in having grain-free foods, which are a lot more expensive than foods made with whole grains. And so, in fact, if anything, I don't think they're quite as good nutritionally. It depends what goes in there. Common ingredients would be sweet potato, which I'm not convinced about as a quality ingredient, but that's used commonly. So, in general, yes, the price of it can tell you something about it, but it's not the whole answer. You have to look at what's in the food. I mentioned earlier about avoiding, like the plague, foods which say meat and animal derivatives, cereals and cereal derivatives and so on. One wants to see the ingredients by name. And reputation comes into it as well, I think.
Thank you.
Laura, do you want to add to that?
The only thing I'd maybe add is, like, it does sometimes go to the other extreme as well with the very expensive foods where it's almost just sold on marketed well sort of thing, rather than like, yeah, there may be high quality ingredients, but then there is a limit to sort of that, and some people then up the price and just market it very well, targeting sort of people who want to feed their dogs human food and that sort of thing.
Yes, that's a good point actually. So foods, some pet foods are sold. Of course, pet owners regard the pet as a family member, and some pet foods are marketed to appeal to the luxury end, what I would call the luxury end of the market there.
Yes, I think that's a really good point as well. That you know, I think it's somewhere in middle of the road. You know, decent price, good quality food. Because yeah, you can get sort of yak meat and seaweed and things like that, which is a bit over the top, I think, in general. Unless, of course, you've got that planned as one of your recipes, John. So just one final question. Just one final question. I think we've got time for here. This is from Andy, who's got a very active 20-month-old German Shepherd bitch, and he said he's actually struggling to keep weight on her and doesn't want to have to keep, you know, to keep feeding the bulk of the food. Is there any other option rather than just giving lots of meals a day or increasing the amount of food she actually has?
Do you want to handle that, Laura, first?
Yeah, I can do. I've got a very active dog myself, so so we would normally say, rather than just keep increasing the amount of food they're having, move to a higher calorie food. So that's quite often a puppy food, or even a working dog food. So they're a bit higher in protein and fat. So they're getting the calories from a smaller amount of food then. So quite often if you cut back their food, they also digest that a lot more easily, but they're still getting all the calories from it. And the other thing as well is just tiring them out in other ways, like training and feeding toys and like mental stimulation, just so they're not constantly burning off all those calories, and they are actually sort of gaining weight, or they're maintaining a nice weight, and they're not just burning off so many calories a day, but they're still sort of tired out, but in another way.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Could I
yes,
make a couple of comments here? Sometimes it's a case of what's causing what. It may be that the energy intake is high, and that's making the dog very active.
Yeah.
And so you give him, I think because he's active or she's active, you give her more food to compensate for that. But instead of getting the weight gain, which is what you're looking for, you actually get an increased level of activity, and she just keep burning it off.
So you're an athlete, really, aren't you? At the end of the day, that you have to keep feeding and training and exercising.
Yeah. I think a danger here is that you become overly concerned about the physical weight, and you can actually cause some health problems. I mentioned these earlier. You can cause health problems by overnutrition, and hyperactivity is just one of them. But it may be that a thin, active dog, she will fill out in time, you know. So
especially for a German Shepherd, to be nice and lean will be quite good on their hips. So as long as they're not sort of emaciated, then
yes, that's right. Sometimes better to have a lean dog which is healthy rather than become over fixated on getting some weight gain, and you can actually cause some health problems then. But as I said earlier, you have to expect people to stop you in the street and tell you your dog's too thin. Although nobody with an overweight dog gets stopped and told you need to lose weight with that dog, you know.
Well,
One's seems acceptable and the other isn't.
Yes, I think that's a problem that we all need to tackle. But I think if we've learned nothing else tonight, you realise what a very fine balance it is in getting the nutrition right for the age of the dog and the life stage of the dog and the exercise of the dog or the cat, and how it's a constantly moving feast, if you'll excuse the pun, over the lifetime.
Yes.
So I think probably we haven't got any other questions, so we'll probably wrap up then. So we have, if we can just move on a couple of slides here, we've got just a couple of links for you here if you want to find out more. You've got the Burns Pet Nutrition Advice Sheets and that veterinary guide to health and nutrition, which John has talked about, which is an excellent publication. And if you're thinking of moving on to Burns, or you are feeding Burns and you want some more advice, you've heard from Laura, who runs the Nutrition Advice Helpline, and certainly there's the numbers there. And as an organisation, the NAWT, we found it incredibly helpful because, as you can imagine, we get all sorts of different cats and dogs coming in with all sorts of different issues, and it's been invaluable to be able to contact that helpline and just get the right advice. So we do encourage you to contact them. And if you've got any questions or anything else that springs to mind once this webinar has finished, then please do feel free to email either John, Laura, or myself. Our emails are up there. Or indeed, you can just email the webinar organisers and we'll be able to point any questions in the right direction. So I hope, I have to say huge thanks to John and to Laura for their fascinating insight this evening. Been incredibly interesting and just a topic there's just so much to learn on. We really do appreciate both of you giving up your time this evening to put on such a great performance. And also thank you very much to everybody for listening to us and for joining us. And if we can just move to the very last slide, then just a reminder, if you have enjoyed this and you do feel you want to make a donation to us, here's how you can donate. Apologies, no apologies for the shameless plug again. Every penny helps us with the work we do with the rescues. So thank you, everybody. I hope you've really, really enjoyed this. It's been absolutely fascinating. And as I say, massive thanks to John and Laura for joining us this evening. To everybody, enjoy the rest of your evening. Put the central heating on because it's pretty cold out there. And hopefully we'll see you all again on one of our future webinars. Thank you ever so much and enjoy the rest of your evening.